In my last video, I showed you how to set up this blog page that archives all the blog posts on your website. And in today's video, I wanted to do a follow-up with that where we're going to be using the same design, but actually designing out our single post template for each one of our blog articles. Throughout this process, we're going to have to do quite a bit of layout work, but we're also going to go over how you connect all this dynamic data. Not only the default dynamic data that comes with WordPress, we're also going to be using ACF to create some custom fields to take this layout even further. If you want to see how to set up a blog post inside GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks, then stick around and let's get started. All right, before we start diving in and building, let's take a look at everything we have here in Figma so we can just kind of get an account for everything we're going to need to build out. Again, we have a hero at the top of the page. In my last video, I had a couple people ask about actually building out this hero, so we're going to do that here in this video. This includes just a solid background with a nice little image. Then we have our big H1 title here, our author name and the category, the featured image, which has some nice rounded corners and overlaps onto the hero a bit. Then we get down here to the content of the post, and what we have here really is a 3-column grid, even though there's nothing in this cell over here. I am going to use CSS Grid for this because it's quite a bit easier to do a layout this way, but we'll just have to make sure that there's nothing in this first column and that our content spans in this second column here. And then over here on the right column is a call to action for signing up for the newsletter, which includes a sign up form. If we scroll down to the bottom underneath the content, we have an author box down here at the bottom. It matches the styles of our CTA up here, so we can probably reuse some of those classes. And we're bringing in an author image, their name, links to their social media, and their bio. We'll probably need to use ACF for some of this, so we'll have to create some custom fields and attach them to the user account, and then bring those in dynamically. And then at the bottom of the page here, we have a section for more blog posts where we see more adventures, this little line accent again, and then 3 posts coming in. So we can play around with the query on this one to make sure we're not bringing the same post into this query, which is a pretty easy option inside GenerateBlocks. So all in all, this should be a pretty simple build out, and almost everything we need to bring in here is dynamic, so we should learn lots of stuff. So let's jump back into our install. This is kind of where we left off. We have this blog page fully built out, but if we click into any of these articles, you'll see they're completely unstyled at this point. Now, I only put content into one of these posts, this bike packing one, so we do have content in this one, and this is probably what we'll use to preview everything. Now, your individual blog post works similar to the way this blog archive works in the fact that it's really a template that's controlling all the posts. You wouldn't want to go into each one of your blog posts and start designing them all individually. You want to create a template that all of your blog posts can conform to. So to do that, we go back into our element section here. We create a new element. It's also going to be a block element. We'll hit create. And I'll typically name this something like blog single post. Over here on the right-hand side under element type, we want to change this to content template. When you do that, it changed the editor width here. And because I have my site set to 100% width everywhere for its full width for everything, I want to change this to full width in the editor as well. So I just changed that to percentage and changed the value here to 100. Now we need to make sure we go down to this location down here, and we want to set this for all of our posts. So if you scroll down under post, you can click on post here, and then it's going to bring in all posts, which is perfect. Of course, you could create multiple single post templates and apply them to different types of posts, but here we just want one template to control them all. Okay, with all that set up in place, we can get to building, starting out with our hero section. So again, I'm going to start this with a container with an inner container inside of it. I'm going to go back to that outer container here, and we're going to add our section class. Again, I'm just going to start with section D. I'm not trying to match everything pixel for pixel, and that'll get me a good starting place, and we can always adjust that if we need to. Let's go ahead and give this a class before we do any styling. We're going to call this blog-hero. We'll go ahead and hit create. We'll start with our blank style here, and we can get going. So as far as the background color, we want that to be our brand primary, which is this really dark green color. Then inside of it, in this inner container, we're going to bring in the post title and the meta information. Now, I know in this layout, everything's centered, so I'm going to go ahead and center align this entire div here just so everything will inherit that. Inside of that, I'm going to put in a headline block. We'll make sure to change it to an H1. And here we want to bring in the post title dynamically. So I'm going to click on the dynamic icon and then click on post title and go ahead and insert that. Now we can see by default our heading color is kind of this dark color here. We actually want that to be white. Probably not worth putting a class on it in this case. We're just really using this for our single post hero. So I'm not going to bother putting in a unique class. We'll just go ahead and style this into typography, change the color to white, and we're good to go on that. Now, underneath of that was our meta information. We already built that out in our blog template. So rather than starting from scratch, I'm just gonna go back in here into our blog loop. We'll make sure that we open up that meta wrapper here. This is gonna be the exact same information. So I'm just gonna copy this entire thing. We'll go back into our template here, make sure we're underneath our title, and I'm gonna paste that in. Now, because this is set up to flex, I'm gonna have to change the flex settings on here to make sure this is center aligned. I don't wanna do that on the class we created for this because that's gonna change it on our blog loop as well. I wanna do this kind of unique to this single post template. Now, we could add some kind of modifier class to it, but again, this isn't really being reused anywhere on the site. This is kind of a one-off tweak, so I don't mind doing this on the default class that GenerateBlocks gives us. So I'm just gonna make sure this is set to flex. We'll go ahead and change that justify content to center. Now, we have a bit of a problem here with the color. The author name and the term list here are both set up to be our text color on the website, but here on the dark background, we actually want these to be lighter in color. Now, we could go to each one of these individually, but we can control all of them if we go here on this meta wrapper. We're already selected on it. Again, I don't want to be on the class, but if we scroll down to typography and change this text color to our white, it's going to go ahead and inherit that value from its parent. So that will get us all set up as far as the title and the meta information on here. The next thing we're going to need is that background image here. Now, there are a few different ways you could do this. The most logical way, I think, would be to just put a background image here on this container. But the way I've actually sized this in the Figma file, I don't think that's the easiest way to go about this and get it the exact size I want. So instead, I think I'm going to use a pseudo element here because I'll be able to control the size of this element a little bit more granularly. So we'll go back here into our blog hero class. We want to set the position of this to relative. So we'll go ahead under the position tab and set that to relative. And now we want to add a pseudo element to it. So under the more dropdown, we'll click on new. We can choose a before or after, it doesn't really matter. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and use a before and we'll hit create. Now, anytime we have a pseudo element like this, we're going to have content in this content field. And if you put in 2 blank tick marks, that will go ahead and satisfy that requirement. And we can go in here and absolutely position this element. Now, right now, we don't have any coordinates set on this. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and just give this a lime green background color so we can see what happens. If I go in here and set the inset values all the way around it to 0 pixels, you'll see it's taking up the entirety of our hero section here. Because we set that hero section to position relative, this absolutely positioned element is going to go fill up all the space to its nearest relative parent. Now, like I said, I'm doing this as a pseudo element because I actually don't want it to be as tall as the hero. If we go back in here and look in Figma, we can see that this graphic actually stops a little ways from the top. I want to make sure I maintain that space all the way through, and with the pseudo element, I'll be able to tell it not to span all the way to the top of this background. So let's jump back in here, and instead of setting the inset to 0 all the way around, I'm going to set the inset at the top to maybe something like 60 pixels. You can see when I do that, it goes ahead and brings this pseudo element down 60 pixels from the top, and that will just make sure we can position this background image to be the right size inside of our hero. So let's go ahead and get rid of this background color now. We don't really need that. Instead, we're going to add a background image. I'll go ahead and select from our media library, and I already have this image set up from the hero I created before, so I'll go ahead and select that and press select. Now you can see it's brought this image in here, and it has some default settings to it. One is the background positioning, which is just set to center. The other is the size down here, which is set to cover. Instead of cover, we actually want this to be contained because we don't want this to be any taller than our section allows. And instead of center, we actually want this to be bottom right. That will just make sure this positions this to the bottom of our section and to the right. Now you can see there's kind of some empty space here, but that's actually been built into this SVG. This SVG actually spans all the way from the top of where you're seeing these lines to the bottom of this hero. So we have it positioned the way we want to, but it's too opaque right now. We actually need to lessen the transparency on this to make sure it matches our design a little bit better. So to do that, we'll go down here into effects and under opacity, and I think something around 20% will do a pretty good job. We can see here it's a lot more subtle in the background here. Now, the reason I really want to make this subtle is if we have a really long blog post title, it's going to overlap this image. It's also going to overlap that image once we get down to our smaller breakpoints. And if there's too much contrast in that background image, then it would be really hard to read the text on top of it. So I think something like 20% works well in this case. Now I can tell just by looking at this that there's not enough padding on this section. My default section padding is just too small for this hero, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that section D, and we'll take a look at the other section classes I have set up. We have section D, which is our default. We have extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large. I'm going to try large first, and I think that looks fairly close, but we have to remember that we're going to have an image that's overlapping here on the bottom, so we're probably going to have to give it more bottom padding than what would look even inside this section. It's going to be kind of an optical illusion once that image is in there and overlapping. So let's come back to that once we get our image in place, and we'll go ahead and set that up next. Now there are a couple different ways you can do this overlapping element. For me, I think negative margin in this case works just fine. So we're just going to set up a new section here that will just have our featured image in it. So I started with this container and an inner container, and then inside of that, I'm going to add an image block. Now we need to bring in this image dynamically, so I'm going to go to our settings here, press on the dynamic tags button, and then we'll go in here and search for our featured image. We'll go ahead and insert that dynamic tag, and GenerateBlocks is going to bring in a placeholder for that image. Unfortunately, we don't get to preview these posts on the back end, so we'll have to do a little bit of back and forth to make sure things are working the way we want to. However, this image by default isn't spanning the entire width of its container. I want to make sure that this always spans that entire width. So I'm going to go in here under sizing, and I'm going to change this width to 100%. So again, I just typed in the percent on my keyboard and it automatically switched that unit. Now we can tell by this default image that it's just way too tall here. So I'm going to use that aspect ratio trick again to do 16:9, just to make sure that we keep a consistent aspect ratio for all our images and we don't have to worry about cropping them exactly perfect. Now there was also a border radius on this, so we're going to go down here to our border radius. We'll link all the sides together, and if I remember right, that was about 24 pixels. Now at this point, we need to pull this image up above our hero section here and make sure they overlap. Like I said, there are lots of different ways to do this, but I don't really see a drawback to using negative margin here. So I'm going to go ahead and go into our margin of this image. And for the top margin, I'm going to do negative 60 pixels. Again, I just typed in PX there on my keyboard. Now we can take a look at this and see if we think it's overlapping enough. We could even reference our Figma drawing here. Here it looks like it's overlapping quite a bit more and there is more spacing in our hero, so let's tidy that up a bit. I think instead of negative 60, we're going to change this to negative 80, which will bring it up just a little bit higher. Now while we're here, I want to make sure that this is always on top of our hero. Sometimes in the editor here, you'll see things with a different Z index, and on the front end, I want to make sure that it's always on top. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that Z index to 2 to make sure that it's above my hero section. Now I think we need a little bit more spacing inside of our hero. I actually think the top padding is fine. It's the bottom padding that's looking a little bit crowded now that it has less space with this image overlapping. I want to make sure to use the clamp values that I use on all these section paddings. So what I'm going to do is just borrow the section XL padding. I don't have it memorized, but if we add that class to it, go in here into our spacing, I can just copy this value here. We'll go back out of that and remove that XL class. And here on this hero section, instead of going into any one of our classes, because I don't want to override those, I'm just going to add this spacing to the bottom padding here directly on the default class that GenerateBlocks gives us, and that will override anything that's on our classes. With that XL padding, I think things look a little bit better at this point, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now before we preview how this is looking on the front end, let's see how it's doing responsively. I'll go ahead and grab this hero container and we'll go down to our tablet. I can see here that our image is taking up the full width here. I probably want to bring that in just a little bit. And if we go here to our mobile version, we have the same problem here. So I think what I'll do is just go to this inner container that holds our image here, and we'll go into spacing, and under padding, I'm going to add 24 pixels of padding on the left and right here on tablet. And when we go down to mobile, I'm going to add 16 pixels of padding just to make it a little bit tighter on mobile where we have less space. I think that's going to be a good start to our hero section here. So let's go ahead and save these changes and we'll go preview what this post is looking like on the front end. Here, I'll just go to our blog page and we'll open up this first blog post. And we can see it's bringing in the title, it's bringing in the author and category, and it's bringing in our featured image here. Now, if we go into the inspector here, we can check all of our responsive settings. Everything looks fine on desktop. As we get smaller and smaller, we do actually run into this issue that the image is touching the edge of the screen before we get to our tablet breakpoint. But once it snaps to our tablet breakpoint, we get those 24 pixels of padding. So we want to make sure that that happens a little bit sooner, just to make sure that this image never hits the edge here. As we get down to our mobile breakpoint, everything looks pretty good on that. So I think we're good to go other than that padding issue on the left and right. And in fact, I think we can solve that a little bit more intelligently than we did before. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that padding on the left and right for my image. I'm going to go back to our section here that's holding this image, and I'm going to give it one of our default classes. So in this case, let's just go with something small like section extra small. That's going to give us a little bit of top and bottom padding, 1 rem here, so the equivalent of 16 pixels, but it's going to add our clamp value for our padding and our left and right here, which is what we're going to want if we don't want this image to go exactly to the edge. Now let's go out of that class here. I want to override that top and bottom padding, so I'm just going to go to our default class here and make sure that we have 0 set for the top and bottom. We'll go ahead and save this again, refresh on the front end. And now as we bring this in tighter, you can see that image is never getting to the edge because the container that it's in actually has some padding to it. So now no matter what size we go to, that image is staying off the edge of our viewport, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, before we move on to our content, I do want to tidy things up a little bit here. I know in our hero section, I want to set this tag name to section. On our container here that's wrapping our image, this isn't really any kind of landmark on the site, so I'm not worried about setting this to a section. Even though it's effectively functioning as a section, I don't think the tag name here really needs to be a section. Let's go ahead and rename some of our elements here. So we have our hero section. We'll go ahead and hit save. We'll rename this one here to featured image. We'll go ahead and hit save. And then now we want to add our new section underneath all of this that's going to house all of our content. So again, we'll go with a container and an inner container. Here on this outer container, we're going to add my section D class, which is just my default padding here. We'll go ahead and rename this while we're at it. So we'll call this content, and we'll go ahead and hit save. Now inside of this, like I said before, we're going to want to use CSS Grid to bring in our 3 different columns, even though this first column on the left is going to be blank. So we'll go in here and we'll give this a class of blog content grid and hit create. We'll start with a blank style here and go into layout, display, and change this to grid. Now, like I said before, we're going to have 3 columns here, one on either side of our content that are equal in size, and then our content straight down the middle. So I think to do this, I'm just going to do 1 FR for our first column. Our middle column is going to be 60 CH, which is character units. I just want to limit how wide that text can be. And then our last column here will be 1 FR. Now you can't really see what's happening here because there's nothing inside of this, but if I go ahead and add 3 containers to this, you can now see that each one of these containers are conforming to those sizes of the grid I set up. So we have this left column and this right column that are equal sizes, and a column in the middle that's 60 CH wide. Now that CH is based off of our font size, so really what it means is it will fit about 60 0 characters in our given font size. This is just a comfortable width for reading. Anytime you have something long form, you don't want it to span too wide in the container, or your eyes have to do too much work going back and forth from left to right as you're reading. Now I can see here that I definitely need some gap in between these columns, so we'll go back to our blog content grid class, back into these grid settings, and we're going to give this a column gap. Now 24 is what I've been using, but I think that's going to be too tight in between our text and that call to action. So here I think I'm going to start with 48, which will give us a bigger gap in between the edge of our content and where the CTA section will go. We're going to change the way this layout happens on tablet and mobile, so I think this is good enough for our setup, although there are probably some more creative ways we could set up this grid template columns to make it a little bit more responsive. I'm just going to go ahead and delete all 3 of these containers I put inside of it, and instead I'm just going to add 2 containers. This first one here is going to be for our blog content, and the second one is going to be for our CTA. Now, currently they're not in the right position, so we'll grab this first one here. In fact, let's rename it so we can easily tell which ones we're talking about. We'll just call this one content, and we'll call this second one CTA. On our content wrapper here, we want this to span from the second column to the third column. So I'm just going to go here to our layout. We'll make sure we're looking at our grid layout. And in our grid column, we're going to put 2/3, which is going to make it span from the second column to the third column, which is exactly what we were after. Now this is just going to implicitly put this other column in the third to fourth column over here, which is exactly what we want. Now we could go in here and be more explicit about it by setting 3/4, but in this case, it's not really necessary, so I'm just going to leave it out of there. To bring in all of our post content, we're going to use the block inserter here and search for dynamic. So the first result we get here is dynamic content. This is a block from GeneratePress, and we'll go ahead and bring in the post content. Now we'll just see a little placeholder here, but if I go ahead and save this now and we refresh on the front end of one of our posts, we'll see that it's now bringing in all the content from our blog post. So if we edit this post, we can see this is all the content from this post. And now that's all being brought in dynamically through our template that we've set up. That's really all we need to set up for the content. So let's turn our attention over here to our CTA. In fact, let's take a look at this again inside of Figma. We can see the CTA kind of sits over here on the right. And what I was picturing is as we scroll down, this was sticky to the top of our container. So it would kind of follow the user down the page so they didn't lose sight of it as they read further on down the article. So we'll go back in here into the editor. And inside of this, I actually want to create a new container that will hold our CTA. This is going to be what's sticky, and the CTA wrapper here is going to be what is the track or what kind of holds our sticky element. So let's go ahead and give this a class. We're going to call this blog CTA wrapper, and we'll hit create. We can start with a blank style on this as well, and we can set up some of our general styling. I know that this had a slightly darker background color, which I think is our sand color. It's definitely going to need some padding in it, so maybe we'll start with 24 pixels all the way around. It needs a slightly darker border, so I'm going to give it a 1 pixel border of our dark sand color. And then it's going to need a border radius here. I think something like 8 will probably be enough since this is quite a bit smaller of an element than the image above it. Now inside of that, we need a heading, some text, and a form. So I'll go ahead and add that in here now. This heading itself, I don't really want it to be a heading, so we're going to use a paragraph and we'll restyle it. So this said, join the adventure. Underneath it, we have just a little bit of text, which I'll paste in here from my clipboard. And then underneath that, we have our WS Forms form. So I've gone ahead and set up this form already. It's our sidebar sign up form, so I'll go ahead and bring that in. Now I do want to restyle this heading a bit. Even though it is a paragraph, I want it to look more like my headings here. And we might reuse this CTA somewhere else. So I'm going to call this CTA title. We'll go ahead and hit create, and we can start with a blank class. Here on the typography, I want to make sure we use our headline font, which is DM Serif Display. That changed it here. And then we need to change our font size. Maybe something like 1.5 rem would fit nicely. I think that works pretty good. We can always come back and play with that. Now it does have quite a bit of gap underneath it, so I'm going to go back in here to our spacing and the margin, and I'm going to change that default down to maybe something like 4 pixels, which will just tighten up the gap between those. As for the text itself here, I do think I want it to be slightly smaller than the text inside of our blog post, so I'm going to make sure that I change this to a GenerateBlocks text block instead of the default paragraph block from WordPress. We'll give this a class of CTA description and hit create. Again, we can start blank, and we'll go down here to our typography, and I'm going to change this font size to something like 1 rem, which is just slightly smaller than our text over here. Now the last thing we need to do to the CTA is add the background image of the mountains behind it. So I'm going to go back in here to our blog CTA wrapper. We'll go into our backgrounds, and I'm going to add an image background to it. Here we'll select from our media library, and I already have an image set up here, which is CTA background image. We'll go ahead and select that, and then we just need to reposition it and resize it. So again, by default, this is going to set to a cover size. We want to set this to contain, so it's only as big as the container allows. And as far as the position, we want this to be bottom center. So I'm just going to type in bottom center, which will push it down here to the bottom. Let's go ahead and save this and check everything on the front end to make sure it's still looking good. And if we scroll down, we have our CTA section here with our new headline we created, the slightly smaller text, our form that I had already set up in WS Form, and our background image down here. All of that is looking pretty good. If we go into our responsive settings here, what we should see is that this area with our content doesn't get smaller as I bring the viewport in, but this CTA does. And that's because I set this up to be a relative unit. It's allowed to shrink and grow, but this one I set at a fixed value of 60 ch, which is what I want. I don't really want this text getting smaller. And once we break down to our tablet breakpoint, I think I actually want to move this CTA altogether. So let's go ahead and just shrink things down here. We can see that that CTA is shrinking, and somewhere around here is actually where we would break to our tablet breakpoint. So let's go ahead and see how we can fix that in here. We'll go back to this container here, which has our blog content grid. We'll make sure we're on that class, and we'll go down to our tablet view. Now, instead of having that grid template columns we set up before, I just want to change this to 1FR, so everything is one single column. Now, because we explicitly put this content on a certain grid column, we're going to have to fix that. We'll go in here to our content, back into the layout and the grid layout, and we're just going to change this to 1, which will get rid of the grid columns we had set before. So now we can see when we're on tablet, everything's taking up the entire width of the container here because these columns are now just set to be one column wide. What that's going to do is just move our CTA from over on the side to down below our content, which I think works fine. We'll go ahead and save those changes, refresh here inside the inspector, and we can see as we shrink this down now, once we get to our tablet breakpoint, everything's going to move down here to the bottom. Now, in this case, I think this is still way too skinny. I think I actually want this to break quite a bit sooner. As soon as our form starts looking funky, maybe anything smaller than like 1244, what we're at right now, I think at that point, I want to go ahead and move this text to the bottom. So instead of setting this up at the tablet breakpoint, I think I want to set up a custom breakpoint for this. So we'll go back in here. I'm going to go ahead and go back to our blog content grid and make sure we're at our tablet breakpoint where we just changed this to 1FR. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that to undo that change. What we're going to do instead is set up a custom media query here. So we'll go ahead and click this button and we can click on new. And to write this custom media query, we're going to type in @media. We're going to open and close our parentheses and put our cursor back in the middle. In this case, we want to write max width and then a colon. And the value that I saw before was 1244 pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and just type in 1244px and then we can hit create. So now we're working within this media query. I can go ahead and change this to 1FR at this point, which is going to stack everything just like we had before. We can see there's no gap in between these. So let's go ahead and take care of that while we're here. We'll give it maybe 40 pixels of gap in between these two. Now, if we hit save again with our custom media query and refresh on this end, we should see here at 1244, our CTA is no longer on the side. Of course, we still need to go and fix that grid column here because it's trying to span two columns, but it's moved our CTA down here to the bottom. We're going to go back here into our content and we want to make sure we're using that same media query. So again, I'm going to type in @media, max width, 1244 pixels, close those parentheses. And then I'll just make sure that we have this grid column set to 1, which should fix everything from spanning multiple columns. We'll go over here while we're still set at 1244 pixels and refresh. And we go down now, we can see this is spanning the entire width of our browser, the full column width, and the CTA is down at the bottom. So now if we're just slightly bigger, we still have the CTA on the side, but once we break that 1244 mark, it just rearranges everything to put the CTA at the bottom. Now this text is obviously more than 60 ch units now. So let's go ahead and go back in here into our content. We're still on this custom media query that we set up. And let's set a max width for this under our sizing. We'll go in here and type 60 ch just to make sure it never expands past 60 ch. And we'll go into the spacing and make sure the margin on the left and on the right is set to auto, which will just center it in the center of our screen. We're going to have to do the same thing for our CTA here. Again, we're still on this custom media query, and I'm going to set this under our sizing to be a max width of 60 ch so it will match. And under our margin here, we'll set the left and right to auto. Go ahead and save those changes, refresh on the front end, and now we can see our text is centered in the screen here and not spanning so far across the screen that it makes it difficult to read. Same thing for our CTA down here, which is perfect. Now, if we get smaller and smaller all the way down to our mobile breakpoint, everything's going to inherit pretty well from what we set up with that custom media query, so I don't think we need to make any more changes to this to make it responsive. Next up inside of this, we need to add our author box. In fact, let's take a look at how this is set up here inside of Figma. We can see the author box comes right after the content. Of course, I didn't mock this up for tablet and mobile version, so we're going to have to make some decisions on how we want this to work. We know once we get to tablet, the CTA needs to go down here below the content, and I think it needs to go below the author box as well. So we're just going to stick this author box inside that same wrapper that has all of our blog content. Now, I was reminded that we didn't make this sticky here, so let's go ahead and fix that first, and then we'll start building out this author box. So making sure I have this container that's holding our CTA selected, I'm going to go to this blog CTA wrapper class, and under position down here at the bottom, I'm going to change the position from default to sticky. We need to give it a top coordinate so it sticks to the top of our screen, but I don't want it to be all the way to the top. I want there to be a little bit of padding between the top of our screen and the sticky element. So I'm going to start out with something like 60 pixels. We'll go ahead and save this and test it on the front end and see if we want to adjust. Now, as we scroll down the page, you can see that CTA is sticking to the top of our screen. And here with the admin bar in place, which is taking up about 32 pixels, I think this looks fine. And it's probably going to be fine when people don't have the admin bar too. As long as it's not pushed up right against the top of the screen, I think that will work just fine. So we'll go back into the editor here and we can start working on our author box. So just underneath our dynamic content, we'll add a new container here. And I'm going to go ahead and give this a class. We'll call this author-box. Now, similar to our CTA over here, we need to set up some of those same styles. We could have maybe given these some more generic names in order to not have to redo some of this work, but I could see us using that CTA box in a lot of places. So in this case, I don't really mind these being two different classes. Again, we'll go with 8 pixels of border radius. We'll go into our spacing here and we'll make sure we have a bit of padding. And then we need to give some kind of gap in between our content and author box. I'm going to go ahead and just do this as top margin on our author box. We'll do something like 60 pixels to start out with, which will just push this author box a little bit off the bottom of our content. Now, the way this author box is laid out, we have 2 columns essentially. Most of the time when I hear 2 columns, I'm going to use display grid. So we'll go ahead and change this to display grid as well. Now, our image is a lot smaller than all of the content, which has our author name and bio and all that. So I'm going to start out with something like 1FR, 3FR, which will just make sure our first column is 1 unit wide and our second column is 3 units wide. And we'll see if those proportions work well once we get all the content in here. So we know we want an image on this left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, let's go ahead and put in a container here, which is going to hold all of our content. Now, right away, I can see, again, I forgot a gap. So we'll go back into that author box and add a column gap, maybe something like 40 pixels, just to give it a little bit of space in between the image and the content on the right. We're going to have to set up some custom fields for all this author information. So right now, I think I'm just going to do a dry run and get all the content in there. And then we can go back and set up those custom fields and get everything connected. So inside this content area, we're going to need a container in here that's a row that will have the author name and then their social links next to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a container here. We'll go ahead and add in a text block and we'll just put author name in there for now. We know we're going to replace that later. Now over to the right of that, we want to have the list of all of our buttons. To keep all those buttons aligned next to one another, we're going to have to add another container for all of them. And I'll just go ahead and add in a button for now. We know we're going to change the styling of this quite a bit, but we can come back to that here in a second. For now, let's just go back to our container that holds our author name and the button. And we're going to go ahead and set this display to flex. We'll change our alignment to space between, so that makes sure to push the buttons over to the right and the author name over to the left. And then for now, I think we're going to align these items center so they're center aligned. Of course, we have some bottom margin here, so we'll go into our spacing and make sure that bottom margin is set to 0. And that will just kind of center the author name and the buttons. Now, underneath all that information, we want our bio. So I'll just go to this container here and make sure we add content after that. And for now, I'm just going to put in a text block and we'll just put in some website ipsum just so we have something in place. Now, again, I think I want this text to be a little bit smaller than the text of our body. So I'm just going to go in here and go to our font size and change this to 1 rem, which will just make it slightly smaller. Again, I didn't use classes on this because an author box is only going to live inside of the single post template, so I don't anticipate needing to reuse this anywhere, so I don't mind styling this on the default classes. We're going to need some gap in between this row that has the author name and buttons and this text here, so let's go ahead and go to our container that's holding all that, and we'll decide how we want to set up that gap. For me, I would probably do something like flex here and set this flex direction to column, which we can do here, which will put it back in place. And then we can just add a row gap here of maybe 16 pixels, which will just bring these off of being on top of each other. Now, I know our text has some bottom margin by default, so we'll go in here to our spacing and make sure we zero that out so there's no extra margin on there. We can do just a little bit more styling here, then we'll start setting up all of our custom fields and connecting all the dynamic data. For the author name, I definitely think I want this font weight to be heavier, so I'm going to change this from the default 400 to 500. I also think I want it to be slightly bigger. I don't want it to be huge, and I don't think anything on our type scale is going to fit exactly what I'm after. So I'm just going to go in here and type in 1.5 rem. I think that's a little bit too big, so maybe we'll go with 1.25 rem. With this text being 1 rem, I think that's going to work just fine. Now, our button here is going to need a lot of tweaks. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a class of social-button, and we'll go ahead and hit create. Now, in a buttons case, I almost always want to move those local block styles over to my new class. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting some of those default styles GenerateBlocks gives it. So we'll go ahead and select move the local block styles and hit start editing. We know we want to get rid of this background color here. We definitely want to change our spacing, which is set to 1 rem and 2 rem. I'm going to do something much tighter, like 8 pixels, and we'll just go ahead and make sure that that's the same all the way around. So I'll select all 4 sides and do 8 pixels. And then we also want to change what it does when it's hovered or focused. Here, I want to change that background color to our dark sand color. And it's going to be hard to preview all this until we have an actual icon in here. I'll go back to our main selector here. I did forget to add some border radius to it. I'm going to add something like 3, maybe even 2 pixels of border radius. We're getting pretty tight here, so I want to make sure it looks pretty decent. We'll get out of our class here so we can add an SVG in here or an icon just to make sure things are looking okay. I think we can use some of these default social ones, so I'll just go ahead and add a Facebook icon here. And then we're going to turn on this toggle for the icon display to show the icon by itself. We actually don't want any text next to this. Now, obviously, white text is not going to work well, so we'll make sure we're on that social button class. We'll go under the typography setting here, and we're going to change this to our brand primary color, which will just make it quite a bit darker. Now, on hover, we're still seeing the white, so we need to go back in here to our hover and focus, and under typography, we'll make sure to give it that same brand primary color, and I think that's a much nicer look for our social buttons. We can go ahead and duplicate this a couple times just to have our different social media feeds. Here we have Facebook. We'll do the next one as X. The next one we can do as LinkedIn. And the final one here we'll set to Instagram. Now, as far as bringing in all the information dynamically, there are a few things here that we can pull directly from the WordPress settings already, and then a few things we're going to need to make custom fields for. I know we can bring in the author name and the author's bio from the default fields that are a part of the user profile, but by default, we don't have a field here for all the links for their social media, so we know we're going to have to add that using ACF. We could bring in the author image based on their gravatar, but a lot of times people don't have their gravatar set up and they're hard to manage if you want to use a different image for your author bio here. So typically what I like to do is go ahead and set up a custom field for this as well. We'll go ahead and set up the things that we know we can use from the default WordPress first, and then we'll go set up our custom fields. So if we go in here to our user profiles, which I just got to by going to users and then selecting my user, we can see I already have the display name set up as my full name. And in here under about yourself in the biographical information, I've just wrote this is my bio. So those two things I know we can bring in pretty easily. First, we'll select this author name here. I'm just going to delete out that text that I hard coded in there, and we'll click our dynamic tags. Again, we'll go down to author meta, and just like we did before, we're going to go with display underscore name. Go ahead and hit add and insert that dynamic tag. And you can see now it's bringing in my name dynamically. We need to do the same thing for the bio down here. So I'll go ahead and delete out that text I added. Click on our dynamic tags. Again, we're going to select author meta, and this time we're going to type in description hit add and insert our dynamic tag, and you can see now it's bringing in this bio. These two things I don't mind controlling from the default WordPress profile, but everything else we're gonna have to set up using ACF. So let's go ahead and save our changes now, and we'll jump into the back end into ACF and start setting up a new field group. Here we'll go ahead and click add new, and we'll just call this author info. Now we need a few different things here. We need the image, and then we need the 4 different social links. So what I'll do for this first one here is just set this as an image field, and we're gonna call this author_image. We wanna make sure that we set this return format to image URL. I think image ID works as well, but I know image array does not. Next, we need our social links. So if we remember, we had Facebook, X, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So go here and add a new field. This is gonna be a URL field. We're gonna say author Facebook URL, and that author Facebook URL field name is perfect. We'll go ahead and add another one here. Again, we're gonna do URL. This will be author X URL. Add another one, URL, author LinkedIn URL, and add one more, which is gonna be URL, author Instagram URL. So now that we got all our fields added, we need to set our location rules. By default, this is just going to show post type is equal to post, but we actually wanted to attach these custom fields to our author. For that, we can scroll down here under user and select user form. And now we can save these changes. We'll go back into our users here. We'll edit my user. And if we scroll down to the bottom here, we should see all the custom fields we set up. We have author info, which is the name of the field group I added. We have the author image, Facebook URL, X URL, LinkedIn URL, and Instagram URL. So I'll go ahead in here and add an image. I'm gonna be this nice lady for now, and we'll put in some default URLs just to make sure everything is working. So I just went in here and added all the default URLs for these platforms just to make sure we can see that everything's working. Of course, you'd wanna go in here and put the actual link to your specific profile, but for now that will get us started. Now I'm gonna open back up all those fields we set up here because we're gonna need to copy and paste all these field names. We'll go back into our single post template, make sure that everything's saved, and we're gonna need to refresh the browser so it makes sure that it's pulling in all the latest information. So for our image, we're gonna go over here to our dynamic tags. We'll select this dynamic tag, and we're gonna do this under author meta. Now for our meta key, we need to go in here and find the name for our author image, which is author image. We'll go ahead and click that, paste it into this meta key field, hit add, and insert our dynamic tag. Now we can see already that this is bringing in this image that we set up, which is perfect. We need to do the same thing for each one of these buttons. I'll just do one of them and then fast forward through doing the rest. So here I'm gonna select this Facebook button, and for the link destination, I'm gonna click on our dynamic tags. Again, I'm gonna go down to author meta. We'll go in here and find our Facebook URL and copy that. Back into the page, we'll paste that into the meta key and hit add. And then we're gonna insert that dynamic tag. We'll go ahead and save this and test it out on the front end to make sure everything's working properly, and then I'll set up all the rest of these. So if I scroll down here to where our author bio is and hover over this, you can see by looking at the bottom left of my screen that that's linking to Facebook. The other ones don't have a link set up yet, but I'll do that same process I did for the Facebook link for all the other social platforms. So I went ahead and got all those URLs added. I also went back to my author bio here and filled in actual biographical information, changed my author image, and I wanted to do this just so we could set up another user and test to make sure that everything's working perfectly. So I'm gonna go in here and add a new user. We'll add this as Susie Q. We'll just put Susie@ogleweb.com, and we'll make sure we set up her name as Susie Q. Now she is going to be an author on this website, so we'll go ahead and add her as an author. Don't need to worry about emailing her, and we'll set up her author image here, and then I'll fill in these URLs with dummy URLs. All right, so now we got Susie's user profile set up. I'm gonna go into our post here, and for this bike packing post, I'm gonna go ahead and change the author here from Kyle to Susie Q. We'll go ahead and update that. Now, instead of seeing all this information for me, if we refresh this, we should now see Susie's information here. I didn't give her a bio, so we can go back and fix that, but it is bringing in her name, her image, and then these individual links, which again, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, which are set up for her user profile instead of mine. So now that we know that's working fine, I'm gonna go ahead and switch this back to my user profile since I know I have all the information filled out in here, and I wanna make a couple other tweaks. First, I don't think I like this image just sitting at the top here. I think I want it to span all the way down to the bottom. So we'll go back in here, we'll select our image, and we'll go in here into the sizing, and we'll make sure the height is set to 100%. While we're at it, we'll make sure the width is set to 100% too, in case somebody uploads an image that's just too small. Now, when you do this by default, GenerateBlocks goes ahead and sets this object fit to cover. In this case, that is what we want, but if for some reason that's happening and you're not understanding why, anytime you start changing these sizes, GenerateBlocks has decided to change the object fit to cover. We'll go ahead and save that again. We'll refresh on the front end, and if we scroll down here, we can see this is now taking up the entire height here. Now for me, this still isn't a great look. I do prefer this image stretching the entire height. We need to add some border radius to it, but I think this bio is just too long. So instead of having to manage everybody's bio and make sure it's the exact amount of characters, I think what we'll do is truncate these bios and then put a link that takes you to their author page where we could have all that kind of information. So let's set up how we need to do that, as well as putting a slight border radius on this image. We'll go back in here into our editor. We'll go in here to the image border settings here under borders, and we're going to change this to that 2 pixel border radius, just like we had on our buttons. It's really subtle, but I think it makes it look quite a bit better. Now what I want to do next is go on this bio class, and I just want to give it a class here. I'm going to have to write CSS for this, so I'm just going to call this author truncated bio. We'll go ahead and copy that class and save it to our clipboard. And we'll save this entire page so we can refresh on the front end and write just a little bit of CSS. Here, I'm going to jump into the customizer, into our additional CSS, and for now, I'm just going to write this CSS in the customizer so we can play around with it. I'm going to type in a period and then paste in that class I wrote, and then we'll open and close our curly brackets. Now to truncate this, I'm going to do a couple things here. I'm going to change the display to -webkit-box. We're going to do a webkit-box orient of vertical. We'll do an overflow of hidden. And then we're going to do a webkit line clamp of maybe, let's say, 5 lines. So we can see when I put that 5 in here, it truncated this down to only 5 lines. We could change this to 2 or 4 or 3 or whatever you wanted here. Now, we're going to have to add some kind of link in here to link to the author bio. So I think something like 4 lines works well with our design. And if people are interested, they can always click the link and finish reading the bio. So I think for now, we'll leave it here at 4, and we'll go ahead and publish those changes. Now, back in the editor, we need to set up that link. So just underneath this author text, I'm going to add a new text block here. And we're going to say, read more about, and then we're going to want to put in the author's first name. To do that, we'll go in here to the dynamic tag. Again, we'll drop this down and go to author meta. And I believe that meta key is first_name, but if I'm wrong, we'll have to go back and fix that. We also want to link this. So I'll go back into our dynamic tag here. We could have done this originally, and I want to link this to the author archive. So what this is going to do is link them to our author page. Now, I don't have author pages set up on here, but on a blog where I had multiple authors, I would most likely have an author page set up where you can read about that author and see all of their posts. Now, I'm thinking that that first name meta key wasn't correct, but just to double check, let's go ahead and save that, and we'll refresh on the front end here. Now, since this is set up as Kyle Van Duzen, we should see read more about Kyle. Obviously, that key is not working, so let me figure out what that is, and we'll pick it right back up. Now, it turns out that actually is the right meta key. I just went into my user profile, and the first name and last name were blank, so all I had to do was fill in the first name here. In fact, if I put Joe and save this, and we refresh on the front end, we'll be able to see that now down here it says read more about Joe. We'll go ahead and change that back to Kyle. And I think I don't want just the name linking. I want the entire line, read more about, and then the author's name, all of that to be linked. So we'll go back in here and we'll edit this metadata again. And instead of linking to the author, we'll just go ahead and take that to none. We'll go ahead and select this entire paragraph here, and we're going to change this tag name from paragraph to link, which will make this a link. And now we can change this link destination here. We'll go ahead and open our dynamic tags. Again, we'll go to author archives URL and hit insert dynamic tag. Go ahead and save these changes again, refresh on the front end, and now we can see this entire thing as a link. And if you click on that, it's going to take it to my author bio page, which you can see up here in the URL. Obviously, I just don't have anything set up for that yet. Now we need to tweak this on mobile, I'm sure. So let's go ahead and go back into the editor. I'm going to do a refresh here just to make sure we have all the latest information in here. We'll go ahead and select this author box, and we'll go down to our tablet setting. Here, I think everything still looks fine, so we're going to leave that just the way it is. But when we get to mobile, obviously everything's looking kind of funky. I think what we'll do is just go in here to our grid layout and change this to 1FR, which will just stack these on top of each other. We probably need to restrict this image size. So in here under sizing, again, I'm going to use that 16:9 aspect ratio, which I think looks good. We need a gap in between the image and the text down here. So back inside my author box, under our grid layout, I want to change this to have a row gap of maybe something like 8 pixels. 16 might look better. Now our name and social links here are pretty cramped, so we'll go ahead and go to that container here. In fact, I'll go ahead and pop open this list view for you so you can see we're on the container that's holding our name and the buttons. Right now it's set to flex with a flex direction of row. All I want to do is change that to a flex direction of column, which will stack those things on top of each other. And then we'll go into our alignment and make sure that alignment's set to the left. So these are all nicely left aligned. We'll go ahead and save those changes. We'll preview it one more time here on the front end just to make sure things are looking good in the responsive views. And we can see now once we get to tablet, these things stack on top of each other. And once we get down to our mobile versions, the author box is stacking with the image on top and the information down below. So I think the last thing we need to do to this page is our more posts section at the bottom. So we'll jump in here and start getting that set up. Underneath all this, I'm going to add a new container with an inner container. We'll make sure to change this outer container to a tag name of section, and we're going to give it our default section class. Now in this section, I do want to have it a slightly darker background. We'll probably use this more articles on other things, so I'm just going to go ahead and set up a class for this. So we'll say additional articles section. We'll go ahead and hit create. Start from a blank class, and we're going to go into our backgrounds and set this background color as our sand color, which is just slightly darker than the other background. Now inside of here, we're going to want a H2 heading. So I'm going to go ahead and add an H2, and we're going to paste in our text from our design. Now underneath that, we want our row of blog posts. Since we already did all that work on our blog page, let's just go ahead and go to our blog page here, and we'll just steal from the work we already created. This is all inside of our blog loop template, so I'll go ahead and click on that. We'll go ahead and copy that entire query. We'll go back into our blog post here and paste that in, and now we have that same exact query coming in here. Now, I don't think I'm going to follow exactly what I did in the mockup because I really like the way this one spans multiple columns. So I think what we'll do is just make a few modifications from here. So here, making sure that I have the query block selected, I'm going to go into our settings here, and we're going to change the number of posts. Right now it's set posts per page to 10. I want to show 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll go ahead and change that to 5, which is going to narrow it down just to these 5 posts. If I save this and we go take a look at the front end, I can explain one of the problems we have that we're going to need to solve. Right now we're looking at this bike packing post. So if we scroll down here, we don't want to show them the bike packing post on this page. They don't want to link to the same page they're already on. But it's pretty easy to fix that. If we make sure we're on that query, we can add a parameter. We can go down here to exclude post, and then there's a drop down here for current post, which will just make sure we don't show the current post people are on inside of this loop. So now if you scroll down, the bike packing post is gone and it's been replaced by the next one in line. I actually think I like this layout better than what I had originally mocked up here in Figma with just 3 posts. I like that it's a little bit more dynamic. However, I did notice that I have this divider here under the more adventures. This is kind of a motif that's been carried over from our blog hero right here. So I want to make sure I get that added as well. And then I think we'll be done with this tutorial. So we'll go back in here to the editor. I'll make sure I have this headline selected. And I think what I'm gonna do is wrap it inside of a container here. Now, right now, this has some default bottom margin, which is probably okay. We might need to adjust it, but we'll make sure that we're selected on this container here. I'm gonna go ahead and give this a class of decoration underline, and we'll hit create. Now, there are a few things I wanna do to set this up. Again, I'm gonna be using a pseudo element for this. So I wanna go in here and set this position to relative. I also wanna go and make the sizing, the max width be max content. That's just gonna make sure that this container here is no bigger than the content that's inside of it, because I want that line to end at the end of this text perfectly. Now, with that decoration underline class selected, I'm gonna go in here to more and add new. Again, we're gonna add a before pseudo element, and I'll hit create. Just like with any of the pseudo elements, we need to make sure we have content in here. So I'm just gonna put in 2 quote marks, which will take care of that. Now, as far as the coordinates, I wanna go ahead and set this to be at the bottom and the right. So we'll put zeros in both of those positions. And we'll set that position to absolute. Now, if we go in here into our borders, which is I think what I'm gonna use to set up this underline, we'll just give it a bottom border of 1 and we'll set it to our primary color. Then we'll go into our sizing. And for now, we're just gonna put 100% width, and you can see this line showed up. Now, it's right on top of our image here. We're gonna have to work on some of that spacing, and it's too close to our text as well. So let's go back in here into our decoration underline class, and we'll go in here under spacing, and we're gonna give it a bottom margin of maybe something like 32 pixels, which will just push it away from these post grids here. Now, we want the same space above it and between the headline. So to do that, I'm just gonna do a matching bottom padding of 32 pixels, and we'll go on our headline here and make sure that we zero out this bottom spacing just so we're not getting some conflicting results there. So now I think I got it positioned the way I want to, but the line needs to extend all the way to the edge of our viewport. So again, I'm gonna go into this decoration underline. We'll make sure that we have that before pseudo element selected, and instead of a width of 100%, I'm gonna do a width of 100% viewport width. This is just gonna make sure it's always big enough. In fact, it's overflowing. It's much too big right now. But let's see what happens if we go ahead and save this and refresh on the front end. So now we can see this is extending all the way outside of our container on the left-hand side. This could cause some overflow issues. So just to make sure I prevent that, I'm gonna go back to our section. This is our additional articles section. And I'm gonna go here under position, and I'm gonna set the X overflow, which is our left and right overflow, to hidden. And this will just make sure that it chops off that line anytime it gets to the edge of the viewport. So let's go ahead and save those changes. We'll refresh it on the front end, and let's go into our responsive settings here and make sure that this line looks good even when we get this viewport smaller and smaller. Now, because we set this pseudo element to be positioned at the bottom right, and because we set the container that it's in to be a max width of our max content, it's making sure that the pseudo element is always positioned at the bottom right and always as wide as the text above it so they align nicely. Now, this text above it is using a clamp functions for its size. So as we get to a big viewport here, it's at its max size. But as we get smaller and smaller, that headline is actually shrinking. And because of that positioning trick, the underline underneath it is also shrinking to match and align perfectly every time. So at this point, I think we have everything set up for our single post here. Obviously, if we go back into our blogs and click into any of these other ones, we'll see the information that is filled out, like the title and featured image and category. We can also see the author information since that's already got an author attached to it, and even static information like this call to action on the side. We also see all of our more adventures and all the other blog posts. The only thing we don't have in here is the content because I just didn't bother filling out content for each one of these blog posts. But because we set all of this up inside of an element, which creates a template for our content, every one of our blog posts on this site will automatically conform to the same layout no matter which post it is. If you made it this far in the video, I just want to take a second to say thank you. I know this ended up turning out to be a whole lot longer than I originally intended, but besides connecting all the dynamic data, which was actually the easiest part of this video, we ended up doing a whole lot of layout work, and I hope you were able to pick up some tips and tricks from that. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to make sure to catch the next one, then hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.